Okay, so this is the 23rd class in the Sefer Touching a City's Soul, Bikur Chicago. We're on page 119, and we're in the middle of the Maimer of the Hasidic discourse that the previous Rebbe said on the 10th of Shvat in his visit in Chicago in 1942. And as we mentioned, that was the occasion of his grandmother's yahrzeit, Rebbe Rivka, and it actually became his yahrzeit years later. So we've been talking about the idea of kavod rosh, the idea of this state of mind that we want to get to before we start davening, because our goal is that our davening should not only be a request for personal needs, which it should be, because like we said, who else are we supposed to ask our needs from if not from Hashem? And at the same time, our davening is supposed to be a service of the heart, that its purpose is, as I'm gonna just reread that one line from last week, that we should advance in matters of the intellect, strengthen his understanding so he can grasp the divine concept in a way that understanding has an effect on his midas, so that's the mind and the heart, in the actual performance of mitzvahs and the deed, right? We want the mind to influence the heart and influence the deed, and his conduct express good character traits, so that expresses the way that we treat other people. So we want our davening to actually affect all four of those aspects of ourselves, and in order to do that, we are trying to get to a state of kavod rosh. So we're trying to define what that means, and in the definition, we've said that means hachna and shiflus, a feeling of submissiveness and humility, and that's like the state that we're trying to get to. And those two words could be translated into English the same way, but they mean something different in the Torah concepts. That it means the idea of how a person could be feeling humbled by physical hardships versus how a person could feel humbled by spiritual hardships or challenges, physical challenges and spiritual challenges. So if we have a sort of a humble spirit, I guess you could say, or like way that we go forward into our davening, that helps our davening be more enlivened, more effective, and then it can work and affect our intellect, our hearts, our emotions, our actions, and our way that we interact with other people. Our davening can help transform that if we've gotten to this point of kavod rosh. So, of course, the question is, how can we accomplish that? It could happen naturally, right, through difficulties, but even with that, or we hope that we weren't going to have that, right? We don't want to have difficulties in order to get to that state. So there are steps that we can take that the previous step started speaking about in the last week, right? About the idea of how can we sort of prepare ourselves for this aspect of kavod rosh, this idea of this mindset of humility to start our davening with. And he said the first step is how we say Shema at night, right? The night before we go to sleep at night, that saying of Shema, that is what sets the tone for our ability to have this humble attitude when we are davening. So how does one say Shema properly? He's going to really elaborate more on that today, but he goes into it a little bit last week, right? How does one do that? Is by doing what's called a cheshbon hanefesh, doing an accounting of the soul before one goes to sleep. When one says Shema, to look back on that day. It's going to get very detailed today in the next section of the Maimer, like how to have a cheshbon hanefesh. It's going to be a little, I'm just warning you, it's going to be a little harsh, very strong, I should say. So just prepare yourself. He's going to be like, as you know, no holds bar kind of thing, like how you could just, really, if it's the worst case scenario, how you could get yourself into that mindset. But last week, this is still just a review of last week. So last week he talks about this idea of, right, that we're making an accounting of the soul before we go to sleep at night, and how we spent our day, thinking about how we spent our day. And that puts us in a humble frame of mind. And then we should be waking up in the morning and saying Moda'ani, and we should be saying Moda'ani with an attitude of gratitude, as he says, right? That we should thanking Hashem for giving us back our neshama. And before we start davening, we should take upon ourselves the mitzvah of loving another Jew. All right, that's that we accept upon. We talked about that last week also. And then we should conduct, after we finish davening, we should conduct our daily affairs, if they're business affairs, with honesty and integrity. And we should be davening and learning Torah. And these are this is like how we go about our day, ideally. And that's where we ended off last week, basically. So I don't know, is there any questions before we go into the new material?
I just have a quick question. Can you hear me?
I think I have to raise my volume a little bit. Go ahead.
So let's say we're in a rush in the morning, or we're exhausted before bed. Whatever it is it better to, if you have only a few minutes, is it better to zip through your morning prayers, even though you're not going to have this time to like have the COVID Rosh and then the same kind of, I mean, do you know what I mean? Is it better to say it if you have a short amount of time, or is that just not right since you're not going to have the same time to get deep into those thoughts and things like that?
I think it's an excellent question. Very practical. So I'm going to answer my thoughts with a little bit of elaboration also. So in general, right, there's two aspects of our service of Hashem. There's the deed, and then there's the intention behind the deed. And that's really right. That's like on the Shabbos class, what we've been talking a lot about, the intention behind the deed. Both of them are very important, and they each serve a different purpose. So, I'm going to share a story that I think we've shared before in class. And I heard it originally from Rabbi Friedman many, many years ago when I was teaching in Bais in one of the earlier years, and I think it left an impression on me, so I'll share it. Some of you may have heard it already, but I think it's still worth repeating. So there's a story about two different Hasidim who I think they were each in some sort of an exile from, the communists would either kill people or would send them into exile into Siberia, which was, just either harsh labor, or they would have to stay in these little tiny towns and like report into the police office, every once a week or something like that until their sentence was finished. So one chassid was, very, very high level, a very, very spiritually exercised person. And it was Pesach, and he had no wine for the Siddharim to have the 4 cups of wine, because he was in this place that he couldn't get wine. But he did have eggs, I think, is what it was. And he had lots and lots of kavana, did a lot of davening, did a lot of singing, really connected to God, and drank 4 raw eggs. I know, don't talk about salmonella and all these kind of things. That's what he did. So for each of his cups of wine, and he said, God, I don't have wine, I'm gonna drink this egg. That's what he had. So with all these spiritual intentions and like lots and lots of mystical intentions and so on. And a second story is about another chassid who was also in exile and came Pesach, and he had no matzah, but his family was able to mail him a package, and they included matzah, and lo and behold, he received the matzah in time to have it for the Seder on Pesach night, which in itself was a miracle. So he had this matzah, and he had enough matzah for more than himself. They would send as much as they could, but they never knew what was going to come, what wasn't going to come, if something was going to be confiscated, if part of it was going to be confiscated. So he had enough matzah for more than himself on the first night of Pesach. And there was one other Jew in that little town who was a very coarse person, not at all, keeping Torah mitzvahs, really part of the peasant population there, very coarse. So this rabbi Chassid, who was in this town, was very, very well respected by the peasants who lived there. That was not always necessarily the case. Sometimes they were mistreated by the peasants, but they viewed him as a holy man, and they tried to take care of him as best as they could while he was in his exile. And he had this matzah, and he wanted to share it with the one other Jew in town. So he invited the other Jew to have matzah with him on the first night of Pesach. And the Jew didn't want to. He wasn't interested in it. He didn't care about it. He didn't want to eat the matzah. It wasn't important to him, and he wasn't going to do it. And the peasants heard that the rabbi, the rabbi of the town, wanted this other Jew to eat the matzah with him on Pesach. They don't have any idea why or the significance of it. They just knew that this holy man wanted this other man to eat this matzah on this night, and he was refusing. So they went to the other Jewish man, who was more, gruff, and they said to him, look here, so-and-so, this chassid is asking you to eat this matzah. We're telling you that if you don't eat the matzah, we're going to kill you. We don't know why he wants to eat the matzah, but he's a holy man. He's telling you to do something. You have to listen to him. And if you don't, we're going to kill you. So the Jew weighed his options and decided to eat the matzah. So the question posed after the two stories was, who did the mitzvah, right? Who actually did the mitzvah? Did this great spiritual giant chassid who had these meditations the first night of Pesach and was, drinking the 4 raw eggs for 4 cups of wine, did he do the mitzvah of having the 4 cups of wine at the Seder? He didn't. He didn't actually fulfill the mitzvah. Did this peasant who, on peril of life, life and limb, because the other peasants were going to kill him if he didn't do it, and ate the matzah begrudgingly on the first night of Pesach, did he do the mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach? He did. He actually did the mitzvah, right? This spiritual giant who had all these meditations and stayed up the whole night talking to God did not do the mitzvah, but this other man who had no desire, no intention, and was only do it so they would be beaten to death, he actually did the mitzvah. What if we ask the question, who was a more spiritually refined person? Well, then I think we would say, hands down, the chassid who drank the eggs, who had this meditative experience with God, was a more spiritually refined person. So, as the Rebbe would say often, right? We learn in the teachings of Chassidus, there's 2 benefits, or there's 2 sort of different ideas, right? One is hamaisa hu ha'ikar, which is the deed is the main thing, right? Hashem wants mitzvahs to be done in his world. Doing a mitzvah in his world makes a dwelling place for Hashem. It refines the world, it brings godliness into the world. Basically, it helps everybody else in the world to be able to overcome their Yetzer Hara, because we brought more light into the world. We benefit, the world benefits, everybody in this creation benefits. Lifting tide rises all boats. We're pulling our weight when we do a mitzvah. And there's also the intention that a mitzvah is done with. The love, the connection, the relationship that we're building with Hashem on a conscious level at the time that we're doing a mitzvah. Both of them are important. We shouldn't give up one for the other. So we need to be working on both of them at the same time. So my opinion, a question that you're asked is, a person, it's good to get into the habit of doing any mitzvah and making it part of our daily routine. Any mitzvah that we're ready to make into our daily routine, we should make into our daily routine. And we should work on catching up our intention and our feeling and our the behind the scenes emotion that we want to bring to the mitzvah, work on our own time. We don't need to jip God and the world out of our mitzvah because we don't feel that we're able yet to be able to do it wholeheartedly or with the proper intentions. Because also we could ask ourselves, what happens, when are we going to feel like we have the proper intentions and we've actually worked on those intentions to the utmost that we possibly can? Like, it's always a work in progress. We could always eat the matzah. We can't say, I've reached the highest level intention that could possibly be, and so now I'm ready to eat the matzah. Hopefully, whatever intention I ate it with last year, it's going to be improved on this year. Maybe it's going to take a backslide the third year, maybe 2 steps forward the fourth year, right? My intention and the heart and soul that I do my mitzvah with is something that I need to be constantly working on, and it's an up and back process. But the actual deed I could always do. I could come through with the deed, even when I'm not in the mood. So we need to sort of work on both at the same time. In terms of davening specifically, which is called service of the heart, which has a little bit of a different category than any other mitzvah of deed, because there is that aspect of the heart. There are certain mitzvahs that we do with our heart. But I think that when we sit down, like it says in Hayom Yom, when we sit down and we say, Eibishter, I want to be davening with all the right intentions today, help me out. That's a perfectly good intention. It takes about 10 seconds. It doesn't have to get us into any huge mindset. It doesn't have to get us into any, meditative state, or if we did or didn't get a good night's sleep last night, or we are very distracted or we're not very distracted, but we can at least set an intention for a few seconds before we start. And we may forget to do that sometimes too. Let's be quite honest. We might just sit down and start opening up the siddur and start davening without thinking about that from time to time as well. Hopefully we can at least catch ourselves before that happens, but sometimes we might not be able to. We'll find ourselves on page 10 without even realizing that we said pages 1 through 9. But we're all works in progress. And if we know that this is what we're trying to aim for and we're trying to get there, and every so often we can get a little bit closer to that goal, I think that's our goal.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Does that, anybody have a comment about that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Very, very much. That's very helpful.
Okay, good. Anybody want to say anything else about that? Disagree with me? You have something else you want to add?
It's really something to keep in mind. It really is something to keep in mind. We're reading about all these high-level chassads and this fiery love that they have for Hashem, and we have to keep in mind that we are works in progress. I think is the bottom line. We do the best we can.
Yeah, and we need to hear about them so that we know that there's a level higher than where we're at right now that we can keep aspiring to, even if we're never going to reach that level. But
right.
If we only hear about one level above us, then it's like, oh, I can get to that next week or next month, right? If we hear about all these other levels, we're like, well, I want to start at least where I am, get to my next level. There's so much more that could be accomplished. I want to try at least to push myself one more rung so that I can get to that. Yeah, but something about davening, I mean, I guess it's not really for the topic of this class, but something I think I'm just going to say for one more minute, especially when somebody's starting to daven, I recommend, and I'm happy to meet with anybody who, wants to elaborate on this a little bit more, but in the beginning, when a person is trying any habit, any mitzvah that they're trying to make into a habit, but especially davening, because it is like another sort of type of mitzvah. I recommend for davening to pick an amount of time every day that a person's going to daven. My recommended time is 10 minutes. To start off by saying, 10 minutes. I'm gonna commit to 10 minutes of davening every day. Let's say in the morning, maybe 5 minutes at night before you're going to sleep, something like that. That's going to be a commitment. And then there's a ladder of tefillah, there's which parts of davening to start with, which to add once you can add, and so on. Because the hardest part of davening for most people I've found is is making that commitment. Once the person makes a commitment, most people can say, I can carve out 10 minutes in my day. And once they carve out 10 minutes in their day and they're into that groove, it's pretty easy to expand it to 15 or 20 minutes. And then, over time, over a few months, let's say, and then they can add and basically pretty quickly get to all the sort of basic tefillos that we hope, that women are obligated to say every day. So that's a strategy, I guess you could say. Anyway, so I'm happy to talk about the strategy with anybody who's interested, at a different time in more detail, unless people decide they want to spend one class on that here. I guess you can email me separately, and I could see if people want to take some time, that maybe at the end of this mimer, before we go on to the next mimer, and we can spend a whole class just talking about davening. I want, if that's what everybody wants, we can just do a class of it. And if not, then, people can reach out to me privately. So just let me know somehow or other, or maybe, okay. Okay, so we ready to go into the next section of the mimer? We're on page 119. Okay, it's section 4, and it's class, like I said, class 23. Okay, so what's going to happen in this section is the previous Rebbe is going to be talking about making a cheshbon hanefesh, making an accounting of the soul, and being, he is going to be talking about all the things that could go wrong in a person's day. And if a person's going to be honest and they did this wrong and this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, right? He's not, like I said, he's not going to pull any punches. It doesn't mean that we need to feel, this is what he's going to do. So, and then he's going to talk about how that could, obviously, I think hearing this is going to make us feel humbled. So I guess that will it be that technique that he's been talking about, but it definitely, it's a different style than I think we're used to. So I just want to put out a little warning there. Okay, so now he's saying, this person, what's he going to do? He's going to make this cheshbon hanefesh. This is what he's going to do. And what's he going to come up with? So when a person evaluates himself according to this process described above, right, this accounting of the soul that we've been talking about, and how he should conduct himself according to Torah, like if he's going to be brutally honest, right, and how he actually conducted himself and how he spends his day, right, so like what's ideal and what did he actually do, he will find that as soon as he woke up, he was already consumed by the worries of the day. Like that's this fictitious person, right? Did he say Moda'ani with this attitude of gratitude? No, he woke up and he got, is consumed by the worries of the day. Even though he said Moda'ani upon awakening as described above, he did not pay full attention to the meaning of those words. In his mind, he came to the conclusion that for the sake of his livelihood and business, he must take to the streets early in order to meet various people. So that's how he began. Then what happened in the pursuit of his business? He acted like businessmen do, saying one thing to one person and something else to another person. Although he was careful not to tell an outright lie, he was not so careful about giving a false impression. So also maybe not 100% honest, right? He also was compelled to listen to idle chatter mixed with a sprinkling of avak lashon hara. That means it's not actual negative talk about somebody else, but it's pretty close, right? So that's another thing, another oish, right? As a result of the above, he couldn't participate in the established study sessions that are held after prayer, another oish, right? Because he was just busy with all this other stuff and hearing all this other gossip. And his prayers themselves were full of extraneous thoughts, which he couldn't get rid of, right? Only with tremendous effort was he able to pay attention to the literal meaning of the words, and even then, his prayers lacked vitality, since extraneous thoughts were constantly distracting him. When such a person makes a good accounting of all these matters of the day, he will find he failed a number of times by uttering falsehoods, gossip, and slander, and speaking a vast amount of idle chatter. So maybe he even did worse than just listen. He actually even contributed. So if the person's being honest, he says, in making that accounting of the day, he might actually come up with these kinds of things. Now he goes into talking, now the previous Torah goes into talking about some ideas that are talked about in Torah and in Tanya, about what the consequences are for a person, or in a situation where a person has done something against Torah, right? So again, these words are going to be in English especially going to sound very harsh because it's going to say punishments and all the things that are happening. I think it's important before we talk about the punishments that he's going to be talking about, which are talked about in Kabbalah and different places in Torah and Talmud, is that what's the purpose of and the priest is going to explain this as well. The purpose of the consequence in Torah is about cleaning, right? Is about repair and cleaning. It's not the way that it's maybe used again to define the terms, right? I think really today, in today's language, even in America, that has become more the norm of attitude versus, like the dictatorial type of image of like a punishing, a spanking as a punishment versus like, you made a mess, you have to clean it up kind of a thing, like a natural consequence. I think modern parlance has sort of caught up to this idea that Torah's had about this concept of cleansing, that the idea of there's that actual sin, the reason why it has an effect that has to be cleansed is because it's actually something that affects us, right? It affects us negatively. So it's sort of like, if a person just eats junk food all the time, they're going to gain weight. And if they want to be healthier, they have to do exercise to get rid of the weight. It's like a natural consequence, right? So the same kind of thing, that it's something that's forbidden according to Torah is called asur, which means forbidden. We translate it as forbidden, but the literal translation actually means it's tied up. It's tied to the other side. It's tied to the side of unholiness. That action, that object is tied to the other side. And so when a person indulges in that activity or in that object, they're connecting themselves to something which life force is coming from the other side. And so it becomes sort of part of them as well. And the process of quote unquote what's called punishment is actually the natural consequence of trying to get rid of that effect from the person. Is that clear? Okay. So now the previous is going to go into this idea of once the person has made this honest, the counting of the soul, and realize that, they weren't so perfect. They had all these like oopsies during the day. Their next thought is going to be like, oh no, now what's going to happen to get rid of all these oopsies? Like that's going to be their next thought process in this cheshbon hanefesh, right? So they're thinking that the appropriate punishment for this is kafakela, which literally means being tossed about as if one were in a sling. That idea is a concept that like the soul is shown the beauty of the holiness and like righteousness and proper behavior, and then they're shown the way that they behaved. So that's called being in a sling, meaning they're being thrown from one idea to the next, and it causes embarrassment. It's like, oh, I'm sure we've all experienced this in our lifetime, right? Where we like go over how we've behaved in a certain situation and we're embarrassed by it, and it just plays over in our mind, and we want to go back in time and choose a different reaction. You know what I'm talking about, right? That never happened to anybody here, only to me, right? And so that's like the idea of kafakela, like, oh gosh, why did I have to say it like this? And then I go up and back in my mind, like, this is what I should have said, this is what I did say, and I'm so embarrassed and I feel so badly and I want to make a repair, right? That's like the idea of kafakela. So the soul is shown this differential between what was ideal and how they chose. So it's like a little embarrassing for the soul. I feel badly about that idea. As is stated in the holy books, that after a person's long life, there are two punishments meted out even before Gehenna. One is Chabad HaKever and one is Kafakela. So Chabad HaKever is the idea of like banging out the dirt that accumulated, and the Kafakela, like we said, is going from being shown like the holy part and then the actual what the person actually did. He's going to actually compare it now to washing a garment, where one soul is tossed about from one end of the spiritual cosmos to the other. Again, it's not a physical tossing around, it's being seen what is holy and what they actually did. That's what it means, the spiritual cosmos. What happened sort of spiritually, what was the idea and how did they behave? Like we're brought face to face with ourselves, basically. Because sometimes we have a tendency to like ignore all of that and forget about it, which is probably to some extent healthy, but to some extent it's not so healthy, because we also have to work it through and be able to make better choices in the future. So that's like the process of growth. So to take an analogy from the physical world, a garment full of stains and dust must be washed out in cold or hot water in order to remove the stains. That's the idea of Gehenna, is like washing the soul. It's a process of cleansing. But before that, one must shake or beat out the dust, and only then is it washed. I mean, imagine like you have, you have the Shabbos tablecloth, and it has big chunks of food and things like that on. You want to put it in the washing machine. You don't fold it up and put it in the washing machine that way. You go outside, you shake it, you scrape off, or like the dishwasher, before you put, at least in my dishwasher, the instructions are before you put the dishes in, you have to scrape off the food, and then you can put it into the dishwasher, right? So imagine it's the idea of Gehenna is like the dishwasher or the washing machine, but sometimes you have to shake out the tablecloth, you have to scrape off the food from the plate before you put it in, and then that's part of the cleansing process. So too with the soul, before it goes to Gehenna, whether a fire or snow, it is shaken out in the kafakel in order to shake out the letters of idle chatter that the person spoke. This idea of fire, snow, again, it's not fire, snow, literally at all. The idea of Gehenna of fire is that concept of cleansing the soul from sins that were committed with passion, with fire, versus snow, sins that were committed with, what we say in Yiddish, kaltkeit, like indifference, coldness, not like a lack of caring almost, like oppositional, but like not passion, right? There's two ways a person can sin: because of the heat of the moment, passion, that they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, or sins of omission, that like they couldn't care less, basically. They don't care that they're trampling on other people, or whatever it is. There's not like passion there. So that's why it's a parable. It's used fire or snow, because there's different ways that a person could do that. So again, the person is making this accounting of the soul, and he's going through his day, and he's noticing all the things that weren't up to snuff, and he's thinking about how the shaking out and the going up and back, and the scraping off, and what with passion or with coldness, like what was the problem? He's thinking about all the ways that he's going to need to be, that he needs to be cleansed, basically. So returning to our topic, when a person makes an accounting of everything that transpires with him, that he is so distant from the divine intention for which God sent his soul into the world, that he becomes stirred with a powerful inspiration, right? That's interesting, right? That term, that's the term in Hebrew too, is soiros. He's aroused. Again, this is not very important to mention, right? He doesn't become depressed. Remember, depressed is not what we're going after. He becomes aroused. Aroused is alive. He becomes more alive, not more deadened. He becomes more alive, becomes aroused, and cries out from the depth of his heart over his great crassness in being attracted to material things so strongly. And his heart aches over the fact that he is not a receptacle for spirituality, that is to say, for godly understanding. He's aroused. This is the bitterness that we're talking about. He took an honest look at himself, and he got himself aroused. He wants to do something about this. Like, he's taking pity on his soul, basically. So what happens as a result? This arousal engenders a firm resolve that from now on he will conduct himself exclusively in accordance with Torah. This is so in other words, he makes a resolution. His resolution is, I'm going to do better the next time, basically. Right? That's what his resolution is. I made a mistake. I whatever the mistake is, from passion or from coldness, I'm going to take a real honest look at myself, and I'm going to do better the next time. And really, like that's I heard this phrase once, which I really like, is like questioning our own virtue. Like that when we're able to question our own virtue, we're able to grow. So he's in this state of questioning his own virtue. That's when we can actually grow. So he makes a resolution, he's going to do better the next time. This is the avodah of Kriya Shema Shal Hamita. This is the spiritual work when we say Shema. In other words, the previous Rebbe just walked us through the mindset that we can say Shema at night from. But going back to Taya's question, even if we don't have the energy to do that every night or one night, let's still say Shema and say, I wish I could do this, what the previous Rebbe is recommending I do tonight. I can't do it, but I am thinking for a second about the fact that I probably made mistakes today and want to do better tomorrow. At least I'm giving some kind of passing attention to it, and maybe once a week, once a month, once a year, I'm going to get to a real accounting of, maybe I'll open up this chapter and I'll go through it again or something like that. And I'll like try to think of what do I have to work on? And this honest reckoning of his spiritual state is a preparation for the Avaida of prayer, right? That's what we're trying. Remember, you said that this whole point is that we're trying to prepare ourselves for prayer, and which lead to Hachna and Shiftless, the two aspects of Kavod Rosh that should precede prayer. Remember, we're backing this up. We're trying to figure out how can we daven properly. Davening properly means with humility. How do we daven with humility? Back it up. We're trying to get Hachna and Shiftless. How do we get Hachna and Shiftless? Back it up. We're trying to make an honest accounting. When do we do that? The night before we go to sleep. So we go to sleep. And then the next section it's going to say what happens to our soul when we go to sleep. While we're doing this before we go to sleep, so that our soul can do what it needs to do overnight, basically, and then we start the next morning with this humility and mindset of saying Maidani properly and then going about our day, and knowing that the next night we say Kriya Shema, right? Which means the next night we know that we're not going to have been perfect during the day, and that's okay. Hashem builds into our process. This is a cyclical process that we go through every day because we're being involved with our animal soul and our body and the physical world every day. So we're working and we're growing and we're working and we're going and we're reflecting and we're questioning our own virtue and we're working again and we're reflecting and we go through the next day. And it's a lifestyle versus a one time, like I'm going to fix this and then I'm done type of thing. You have a question?
Hi, I have a question. What happens when the soul goes up at night, goes up to Shemaim? What happens when it comes down?
Yeah, the next section is going to be talking about what we're making this honest accounting in Kriya Shema, and then what's going to happen when we go to sleep. And then we already said what happens when you wake up the next morning, but this last section is talking about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, maybe we'll get to it now. Okay, are we good to go or questions?
I think one of the problems that I have is that when I'm thinking about what I did during the day, what I did badly or what I did wrong is so painful that I don't even want to think about it. If that makes any sense. I know what I'm doing wrong. I know what I'm doing wrong, but to actually delve into it is so painful that it's not denial. I think that if I really went into it, I don't know. I don't know what would happen. I don't know if that makes any sense. It's not that I'm doing terrible things, but I'm doing things not well. And to go into those things that I'm not doing well is just I can't really go into it. I really can't. I can't face it. I can't face the shortcomings, is what it is.
Well,
Down, you're frozen. You're frozen.
I'm frozen.
Okay, you're better. You're back. Okay.
Well,
You're frozen again. Sorry, everybody. Frozen. Okay.
am I frozen for everybody or just okay?
No.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I mean, that's how you feel. So you might want to consider whether you're being too hard on yourself, for starters. But it may be it's not something that you want to spend time going into if you think it's just going to drag you down. Maybe it's rather that you want to spend time thinking about something you're going to do positive the next day. That I don't know that the goal is to beat ourselves up, but there can be some, the goal is not to beat ourselves up. Maybe there's something that you could think of that's related to whatever it is that you feel you need to work on, and you could take on a positive something that you can, work on that's related to it instead of addressing it directly. It talks about in Hayom Yom that there's two ways of curing a problem. You can, and it's similar to the two ways of healing something physically is similar to the two ways of healing something spiritually. The issue itself can be addressed, the illness can be addressed and fixed, or the surrounding areas of the body can be strengthened to compensate for the weakness in the body, where wherever that weakness is. And that's also true for spiritual ailments, meaning we could address the ailment directly, and we can strengthen the surrounding areas as well, which are really discussed as being like tshuva and ma'asim tovim, doing tshuva and doing good deeds. So sometimes maybe we need to focus on the positive and bringing more positive before we address something else. And sometimes through addressing the positive and just thinking of the positive, it sort of has a trickle down effect on that negative thing. So especially if it could be, I don't know, it could be something like, I'm thinking in the physical world, I don't know if this even makes sense, but like this is something like, let's say somebody has high blood pressure. So they could take high blood pressure medication that, takes the blood pressure down. That's maybe addressing it specifically, but then there are doctors who will tell you, well, maybe eat a little bit better and do a little more exercise. It's not addressing the blood pressure directly, but it's going to have a trickle down effect on the blood pressure eventually, right? You're making a lifestyle change that's positive, and it could even affect to the point where they don't need to have blood pressure medication anymore. So sometimes there could be something that we're working on, and maybe it's just too big a thing for us to work on, or it's too painful, or it's too much. Whatever it is, we're not ready really to address that issue. We know it's there, we're not ready to address it right now. So we can maybe address other things that we can strengthen. And when we're putting our efforts and energies and focus on something else that we're strengthening, we're ignoring that a little bit. So maybe it doesn't rear its head quite as much, first of all. And second of all of that good work and refinement, it has an ancillary trickle-down effect on whatever that other thing is we're trying to work on, and it becomes kind of smaller and smaller, both in our mind and probably in practice also, until it could disappear by itself without ever being dealt with head-on, or it could get small enough that we feel like we can address it then.
Thank you. No, that's great. Thank you. That's good advice.
Okay.
What were the two things you said to focus on that helped? Teshuvah and masim tovim.
Right.
I think that Malka's question is so helpful or comment, because I think, I can certainly relate to it, but I was thinking that it's such I can really relate to it. Elul. It's Elul right now, and the same kind of thing happens where you can beat yourself up a lot to the point where you don't want to do the work, or it's kind of like, well, I said all this last year, I'm almost embarrassed that I'm still working on so it can be the same thing a little with Elul as what you said about, what Malka was saying as well.
Yeah, and I think it's often, there's sort of like systemic challenges that we have, and often we it's sort of like our tendencies, right? We have certain tendencies, and that we can be working on them in certain areas and overcome obstacles in certain areas, and then that same kind of tendency can show itself in another setting or in a more refined way, and we're dealing with it again, not because we haven't been dealing with it, but because it's a new venue for it to show itself, or it's a more refined venue to show itself. And we may have gotten through part of it, but we haven't really finished the work of that tendency And so we still find ourselves having to address it some more. And it's not necessarily because we didn't address it before, there's something bad. It's just that we're still having to work on it because it's a new situation or it's a new level of that tendency. And it's coming up again. That's all. We just have to work on it again. It's like, oh, I thought I got rid of that, yelling when whatever. It's been dormant for so many years or something, but this just brought it right back up, right? Someone's like, okay, but I'm not perfect. So that means like there's still work to do. Okay, good. I've got more work to do. Okay. But whatever the example is. So. Any other questions?
Do tzaddiks deal with this issue? Or are they way above that where they're totally connected so they don't have this argument or whatever within themselves?
Yeah, so it's tzaddikim and the definition of the Tanya, there's different you have to know sort of which definition of tzaddik we're dealing with, but the definition of a tzaddik in the Tanya, they're not dealing with this. They're not dealing with this anymore, or maybe even ever. They're here to help us deal with it, So they know these issues because they're connected to the souls of the generation that they're leading, but they themselves don't have these conflicts, these internal conflicts of Yetzer Hara, Yetzer Tov, that kind of thing. They have another job rather than self-refinement. Their job is responsibility for the generation. So, kind of a big order. Okay, are there any other questions? I'm kind of debating because I feel like there are 9 minutes left of class. I don't think that's going to be long enough to do this whole next section. We could try. If you want to try, we can try to sort of push through it, and that's the end of the mimer. This next section is the end of the mimer.
Let's not push through it. Let's
Yeah.
not push through it. Did we do the summary?
What? Read the summary. Did I not read it? I didn't read it. You're right. Okay, so let's read the summary, and then maybe next week we can do the last section of the mimer, which I don't think will take a whole class, but again, we never know. And then we'll have and then we should have a review. Okay, so let's read the summary. So on page 125. Okay, so the avodah of Kriya Shema Sha'al Hamita, that's the Shema that we say before we go to sleep at night, is a person's self-reckoning regarding the course of his life. He's developing the recognition that the main thing for him is material matters, his preoccupation with making a living, the great amounts of idle chatter he speaks and hears, the falsehood, gossip, and slander he speaks, the fact that he doesn't pray with a minyan and his prayers are full of alien thoughts, for which he will be punished with chibut hakever and kaf hakela. Meaning, again, just sort of facing ourselves directly at, with this din v'cheshbon and with all the things that we've been talking about in class. So doing that helps us to have a humble approach, which that humble approach is the Kovod Rosh that we are gonna hopefully be davening with the next day. That's sort of like the goal. So then, right, the last section is going to talk a little bit about what happens in between saying Shema and saying Moda'ani the next day, and how that relates to this whole idea of Kovod Rosh. And then And then that's really the end of the mind. We're talking just about this idea of, how we can get to the COVID rush for davening. So probably, I guess maybe we'll end here. I wanted to actually just, I'm gonna stop the recording.